Hello, fellow founders. Welcome to Startup Gospel, where there's always good news for your startup. And maybe your host too, because I am nearly free of this COVID-like illness that has sidelined me for the last couple of weeks. It's a huge bummer because I had originally recorded most of this episode from Helsinki, and I was so excited to launch an episode while sipping on blueberry juice and my skin glowing from the sauna treatment, but it was not to be. Instead, I am back home in Music City where summer lives on. So let's get ready to make this episode rock and roll. It's so bad. I feel like I lost a part of myself in Europe. All right, so this is the last episode of the inaugural series called Surfing the Big Wave, where I was trying to answer a family friend's question of, should I start a startup? He's actually an old man now, unfortunately. I shouldn't have told him to wait for these videos. And my answer was, in effect, well, let me tell you what it's like and you can decide for yourself. And the first of the metaphors I came up with was, well, it's like surfing a really big wave. And we ended up talking about mindset adaptation and what kind of mindset makes big wave surfers successful, how they know their breaks really well. And now this episode about how surfing is less about the actual surfing and more about reading waves and positioning yourself correctly for each opportunity that comes your way. Now, I never intended for this whole thing to get this long, but before you can write the short letters, you gotta write the long letters, right? So if you haven't seen part 3, I'd recommend checking out that episode as my most watchable video thus far. It'll catch you up on everything. Episode 1 and 2 were All right, Jake, take us to Jericho Barrel. All right, at Jericho Barrel, we're gonna gain some intuitions for why startups are not really about running a company, but more about reading and positioning against opportunities correctly. I mean, yes, you do have to run a company competently to be successful in the same way that you have to actually ride the wave, which is not a skill-less endeavor, but you can flip the direction of the dependency to see that one is more important than the other. So for example, if you are super skilled at riding waves but have no waves to ride, then what? Or if you are super skilled at running a company but have no market opportunity, then what? Okay, so clearly one is more important than the other. Now there's 3 beats as usual. The first idea is that surfing is not really about surfing. It's kind of more like wave orienting. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. In the second section, we're going to talk about how startups are less about running companies and they're kind of more like market orienting. And then lastly, we're going to go through some common failure cases to illustrate some of the concepts in this video. All right, let's hit the waves. Okay, it's story time, as has become tradition the last couple of videos. So if you're just tuning in for the first time in this video, all of our stories so far have been set at Costa Dulce, an eco-lodge retreat in Nicaragua near the Costa Rica border. It's a place near and dear to my heart that I love visiting for a revitalizing dose of sunshine in the winter months. And every year I do an intensive week-long surf camp with the local instructors. So Freddy's the lead instructor there. And as you can imagine, like 95% of the time, he's just teaching total beginners like myself. Well, after 3 years of annual immersions a week at a time, this past February, we're out on the water during a particularly quiet set of days, and he starts riffing on the more theoretical aspects of surfing for the first time. And he says something in passing that totally changes my trajectory as a surfer. He says, the closer you take off to the peak, the less paddling you have to do. Now, in the moment, I'm kind of like, yeah, duh. But later that day, as I'm reflecting on it, I have this Zen moment of total understanding. And it's like I instantly ascended a couple of levels on the path to enlightenment. All right, so that video was brought to you by Veo, and I just have to show you this other one that I got on the first try, which I think was less visually impressive, but actually a more accurate visual metaphor for what happened. All right, take a look. So in this one, Freddy disappears, and he turns into the steps that I walk on, not really ascending very high at all. Thought that was actually maybe more accurate, though somehow less visually impressive. All right, now it's your turn for the same realization. Let's visualize what Freddy was talking about by looking at a scene of a wave developing. Okay, so here's the thing about wave. Now, the camera here is pointed kind of mostly from this angle, but if we were looking at this wave from the horizon, what we would see is that it would have a peak as it develops. It would be subtle, I'm obviously exaggerating, but that peak, as you can see, is here, okay? And the other part of the wave that's important for surfing is the shoulder. So basically, as that peak develops, there's a part here that is slightly off the peak called the shoulder of the wave. And in theory, what Freddy is saying is that the closer you are here, the more of this like kick you get, the less paddling you have to do, and then you can kind of angle yourself into the shoulder, and then boom, you drop in. And that's the best way to catch a wave. All right, so let's see how the wave here develops. I'm gonna hit pause on that right there. Okay, so you see the wave, the peak is flipping, and boom. All right, so let's see how a person actually does on this as we watch. Okay, so here is the peak. You can kind of see that the lip's already forming. So this person is perfectly positioned. So what we should see is that they don't have to work very hard to get this wave. The wave should just take them. And indeed, that's what we see. All right, very cool. Okay, so if everyone understands this concept, it should be the case that everyone is trying to get to where the peak is, where they can expend the least amount of effort to be able to catch the wave. And indeed, that is what you see. When a lot of people do this, they position themselves in such a way that it looks kind of like a line, and that's what's called the lineup in surfing. Now, in this particular example, it does seem like there's maybe kind of two lineups that are formed here. One is of the people that are kind of further out. I think they're maybe waiting for a bigger wave, not really engaging with some of these smaller ones, but here, as you can see, well, there's a peak over here that's already been broken, but you can see the shape of the wave pretty much here, right? And this looks like it might be the peak. There is a row of people that are all kind of looking back here, trying to catch the same wave. Now, what's gonna happen is as the wave rolls in, they will all be positioned at various parts of the shoulder. Okay, so let's see that happen and go forward. Oh, I just had a realization. It's because I have another monitor up here. That's why everything's breaking. Okay, I'm gonna need a new laptop. I'm gonna need to go pro, y'all. Okay, so now you have a mental model for what I mean by diagnosing and positioning relative to the wave. Now this leads me to an interesting aside because I wish surfing was actually taught a little differently now that I have this mental model. First, if I were teaching a beginner how to surf, I would say there's actually two phases to our learning. The first phase is what I call basic mechanics, and the second phase is what I'd call orienting, which is what I'm trying to emphasize in this video. In the first phase, the only goal is to get some basic mechanics down, and this fundamentally depends on how athletic you are and how much you've been exposed to other board sports so that you have some basic knowledge that might translate. But the goal is to be able to navigate the ocean on a surfboard and pop up and ride the wave. Now, this could take you a session if you're super athletic, or it could take you many weeks to get out of this phase if you're very new to all this. And during this phase, the surf instructors actually hide the orienting part from you completely, since they're in the water with you and giving you a push at the exact right time, at the exact right place, so you can focus on the standing up part. That's also the part that's friendlier for vacation photos. Now, to be fair to modern surf instruction, that's probably optimal for their day-to-day experience, but as a result, they don't really explain any theory, and I think this actually holds back a lot of surfers, at least the ones that are serious about becoming good at surfing. And that's the thing, isn't it? Like, who wants to hear about theory when their main goal is to have fun on vacation? And how is a surf instructor supposed to know that you're one kind of student versus the other when 99% of the time you're gonna be the former and not the latter? But still, if it were up to me, I would definitely want to point this out. And especially when it comes to startup founders, I think, yeah, this is the type of mindset that we want to have. We want to understand why things work the way they do. And so I think my retention rate, if I were a surf instructor using this approach, would probably be like sub 1%. But that 1%, it will go on to change the world. Let's go. Okay, so what's the equivalent of all this in startups? I would say, okay, same slide as last time. Being a beginner founder has two phases. I would say the first is mechanics, and the second phase is orienting, which we can also interpret as just reading and positioning relative to the opportunity. So what do I mean by basic mechanics? Well, forming a legal entity, developing an operating cadence, hiring and recruiting a team. Basically anything you got to do that it looks like you have a company from the outside, and this is all the stuff that's like pretty well documented in my opinion. Now, orienting, that's a part that's talked a lot less about in the general space of startup lore, but I think even less is anyone telling you to care about it or to call it out. It's kind of what I'm doing right now. I would say, remember, your last day as a true beginner surfer was the day before you realized that your actual job is to read the wave and position yourself correctly. Similarly, your last day as a noob founder is the day you realize that the orienting part is your actual job. Okay, so let's talk quickly about what orienting looks like in practice. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here since this is more about adjusting your mindset than the actual techniques, but I think it helps to be grounded in what it actually looks like day to day. So orienting is basically like, why are you doing what you're doing, right? And when it comes to startups, another way to say that is, what is the opportunity? And to identify what the opportunity is and what you should do about it, I would say there's two concepts, diagnosis and decision, which as a sidebar is the primary job of the executive, which we will go over in a future episode because I think that's a really important loop there. All right, basically, once you're bought into the concept of orienting relative to an opportunity, then it becomes really simple because then you got to recognize that the quality and correctness of the strategy to win the opportunity is what really matters. And that's really dependent on the sharpness of the diagnosis and the correctness of the subsequent decision coming from that observation. And you might ask, okay, well, how do I improve those things? Well, that's kind of the main purpose of the business part of this channel, which is mental models. The better your mental models, the more accurately you see reality, the better your diagnosis, and the better your decisions, right? Lastly, let's make some of this concrete by looking at a few examples that I see all the time in early stage startups. Okay, so the first case is called the perpetual beginner. And the subtitle here is the beginner washing machine. Now, in surfing, there's something called the washing machine that you can end up in, which is, let's say you try to go for a wave and you kind of fall off the wave. Well, now you happen to be in the exact crash zone where all subsequent waves are going to come for a little bit. You might end up getting tumbled, meaning underwater, as the waves break over you. You got your surfboard getting caught by the waves and you're kind of upside down in the water, you're disoriented and all that, and that might take a while to get out of. So that is a reality for many beginner surfers until you kind of get a little bit wiser to that dynamic. Now, what I mean here is that there is a case where as a beginner surfer, you completely ignore the fact that this happens to you. Like, you're so fixated on surfing being the actual riding of the wave that when you tell the story of what happened, you're like, oh, I caught 3 waves, but you ignore the part where you spent 90 minutes in the washing machine, and you think of this as completely normal. Now, the application of this to startups, you can imagine, is where someone is so focused on running the company, but they're not thinking about the amount of times they're floundering in their strategy. And so when they tell their friends, they tell their family members about what it's like to do a startup, they're just thinking like, wow, look at me, I'm running the company, I'm hiring the team, I'm going through the motions. And they are completely ignoring the fact that like maybe their strategy sucks or the opportunity isn't there or the market's not there and so on. And so that actually really holds back a lot of companies, and unfortunately that's what makes you a perpetual beginner, basically. It keeps your company from achieving the success that might be possible if you just spend a bit more time noticing that you're actually in the washing machine. Okay, the next common failure case is not actually reading the wave. So this kind of surfer knows all the motions of how to surf. I talked about this a little bit in the last episode where you kind of just memorize your spawn point and you kind of know okay, I got to go through the motion of paddling. I paddle for 5 seconds, I stand up, and then I catch the wave sometimes. And so you can get kind of far doing this because you can certainly be seen, looking competent catching waves. But if you don't understand the first principles of how to read that wave, how to spot the peak, how to orient the shoulder. Is a left-hander or right-hander? We didn't even talk about that yet, but that's a key concept in surfing. You're gonna drop it on that shoulder. If the closer you do it to the peak, the less you gotta paddle, right? That if you don't know why you're doing any of that, you're just gonna catch a lot fewer waves. So maybe by the time that someone gets a snapshot of you surfing, you know how to ride the wave. You're good at that part, but they don't really see the inefficiency that preceded that moment. In the startup world, this basically looks like you don't know your industry or your customer well enough, and you don't understand the first principles of how that proverbial wave forms. So sometimes it comes, sometimes it doesn't. It is very erratic. Obviously, when it does come, you're like, whoa, great, I'm on the wave, and your company kind of makes a couple leaps forward. But then that wave goes away mysteriously, like the growth stops on the top of funnel or something like that. The leads stop coming. You don't know why. You're just and you just conclude, oh, well, I guess there's no waves today. No, you got to figure out how does that wave become consistent? How do you make sure that you can capture that wave consistently? Where do you go so that the peak is always there? And that might require changing things pretty quickly. You might have figured out one strategy that works for a few months, and then a couple months later it stops working. Well, maybe the peaks are kind of breaking in different spots, right? You got to be able to meet them. So. Okay, another very common failure case when it comes to surfing is being too early or too late on the wave. The way this looks in startups is being early oftentimes is the market isn't ready for your product, and you have to constantly make people care about it and so on, and maybe you don't really understand how to position that product or say it in a way that they know how to buy. That's actually, the same thing with waves, right? If you want to be the first to catch the wave, you kind of have to be slightly early on the wave. You kind of have to have perfect reading of the wave and then exactly know where the peak is. So there's some work to be done before the wave actually breaks if you want to be the first to catch it. And I think startups are very similar. But the much more common case is that startups will work really hard on an opportunity that's not quite there yet. And so in that case, they're early on the wave. And I guess the second case is being slightly late, where I guess the moral equivalent here would be you don't really know how to read the peak or position on the shoulder, so whereas a competitor does, and so you find yourself always having to yield when they catch that wave first, because you're on the shoulder and you don't have priority on that, right? So in the startup world, that would be like your competitor's always doing like the right thing, and you find yourself copying. By the time you copy, they're doing something else that's right, and you're usually off. So that's usually the result of poor mental models, which if you watch this channel, won't be a problem for you. All right, lastly, one of the common failure cases is being at the wrong beach, or at least the wrong part of the beach. And the lesson here is, well, you can't have fun if there are no waves, right? So here, what you might observe is perhaps no one in your industry or market is catching waves. In surfing, that's, it's more visual, so it's very obvious if someone is, but you're not. But you can kind of feel if, like, is your industry in a recession, or there's someone who's doing well, but just not you. So being at the wrong beach would be in the case where no one's catching waves at all. But if someone is catching waves, then you might be at the wrong part of the beach, and it's a perfectly fine beach. You're just not in the right place. They might be doing something that's fundamentally different enough that they're metaphorically in a different part of that beach, or they've positioned themselves slightly differently in the industry. And so in the future, we're going to talk about how product marketing is actually how you can paddle yourself to a different part of the beach and catch different types of opportunities simply by describing your product or your storytelling slightly differently. It can be the exact same thing, but you're going to explain it differently, and then suddenly it seems to work. That happens not infrequently. All right, that is part 4 of Surfing the Big Wave. We can finally put this series to rest now. In retrospect, that was way too big of a topic and overly ambitious for my current level of presentation and editing skill. I think where we go from here is a little bit more practical and concrete for a while, at least until I'm more practiced as a presenter and can take on these bigger scoped topics. In addition to surfing the big wave, I did have 2 more metaphors about what it's like to succeed at building a startup, which were, it's like going pro in a sport, and it's less like building a house and more like curing cancer. But we'll do those down the road when the time is right. I'm also excited to be working on some gospel-themed videos, which will be the next ones out on this channel, so stay tuned for those. Until then, may peace be with you, and for those who have been entrusted with much, remember to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. All right, catch you in the next one.